The night was cold when Mira stood trembling on the porch, her father's furious shouts still ringing in her ears. "You bring shame to this family," he had roared before his foot struck her side, sending her stumbling onto the rain-soaked ground. Clutching her swollen belly, Mira sobbed as the door slammed shut behind her, locking her out of the only home she had ever known. Pregnant, penniless, and alone, she wandered the streets, her thin jacket doing little to shield her from the storm. The weight of her situation pressed down on her with every step. She had no one to turn to, nowhere to go. The man who had promised to love her had vanished the moment she told him about the baby, and now her own father had cast her out like garbage. Tears blurred her vision as she walked, the icy rain mixing with the salt on her cheeks. She wondered if this was how her story would end, broken, forgotten, left to the mercy of the night. But fate had other plans. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, slowing as they neared her. A car pulled to the side of the road, and the window rolled down. "Miss?" A man's voice called out, calm but firm. "Are you all right?" Mira turned, her heart pounding. She didn't know it yet, but this stranger, a lonely doctor named Ethan Carter, was about to change her life forever. Mira froze at the sound of the man's voice. Every instinct screamed at her to run. She had learned the hard way that trust came with consequences. But exhaustion and the sharp ache in her side kept her rooted in place. She turned slowly, her wary eyes meeting the gaze of the man in the car. He was older than her, perhaps in his late 30s, with sharp features softened by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as though he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes held a quiet intensity. "You're hurt," he said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a question. Mira instinctively curled an arm around her stomach, shielding her unborn child. She said nothing, her breath coming in shallow, nervous bursts. The man hesitated, then reached slowly for the inside pocket of his coat. Mira tensed, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open. A hospital ID card gleamed under the dim light. "My name is Dr. Ethan Carter," he said. "I don't want to scare you, but you shouldn't be out here like this. Let me help." The rain pattered against the pavement between them, the silence stretching. Mira's teeth chattered, whether from cold or fear, she wasn't sure. But the weight of her loneliness pressed harder than her suspicion. "Where would you take me?" she whispered. Ethan studied her for a long moment before answering. "Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe. Just for tonight." Something in his voice, a weariness that mirrored her own, made her hesitate. Then, with a trembling breath, she took a step forward. The car door opened with a soft click. And just like that, Mira stepped into the unknown, leaving the storm behind her. The car hummed quietly as it cut through the rain, the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers filling the silence between them. Mira sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her damp clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if afraid she might unravel if she let go. Ethan didn't press her with questions. He kept his eyes on the road, giving her space to breathe, to think. The only time he spoke was to ask, "Are you warm enough?" before adjusting the heater slightly. Mira nodded, though she still shivered. Not just from the cold. They turned onto a quiet street lined with old oak trees, their branches swaying in the storm. At the end of the road, a modest two-story house came into view, its windows glowing softly against the darkness. Ethan pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he said, "Wait here," before stepping out into the rain. Mira watched as he hurried to her side, opening the door and holding out an umbrella. She hesitated before accepting it, her fingers brushing against his briefly. The gesture was small, but it sent an unexpected warmth through her. The inside of the house was neat but lived in. A worn leather couch sat in the living room, stacked medical journals covered the coffee table, and a single framed photo of a smiling woman and child rested on the mantel. Ethan quickly moved past it, as if avoiding its gaze. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said, grabbing a towel from a nearby closet. "You can clean up, and I'll find you something dry to wear." Mira clutched the towel to her chest, her throat tight. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan paused, his back to her. When he turned, his expression was unreadable. "Because no one should be out in that," he said simply, nodding toward the storm outside. For the first time that night, Mira felt the weight of her exhaustion fully. Her legs trembled, and she leaned against the wall for support. Ethan's demeanor shifted instantly. "You need to sit down," he said, guiding her gently to the couch. "When is the last time you ate?" Mira couldn't remember. Without another word, Ethan moved to the kitchen. The sound of cabinets opening and a kettle being filled the silence. Alone in the quiet living room, Mira let herself exhale. The scent of old books and faint antiseptic lingered in the air, oddly comforting. Her eyes drifted again to the photo on the mantel, but before she could study it further, Ethan returned with a steaming mug and a plate of toast. "Here," he said, setting them on the coffee table in front of her. "It's not much, but it'll help." Mira stared at the food, her vision blurring. A single tear slipped free, splashing onto the toast. Ethan pretended not to notice. He busied himself with folding the towel she'd used, then said, "There's a guest room upstairs. You can stay as long as you need." Mira wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "You don't even know me." Ethan met her gaze, his own shadowed with something she couldn't name. "I know enough," he said quietly. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, for the first time in months, Mira felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The guest room was simple but clean, with pale yellow curtains that caught the first light of morning. Mira woke disoriented, the events of the previous night rushing back in a flood of memory. For a brief moment, she expected to hear her father's heavy footsteps outside her door. Then the scent of brewing coffee drifted up the stairs, and she remembered she wasn't home anymore. She dressed slowly in the borrowed sweatpants and oversized t-shirt Ethan had left outside her door, the fabric swallowing her slender frame. When she finally descended the stairs, she found Ethan in the kitchen, scrambling eggs with precise movements. "You should eat," he said without turning around, as if he'd sensed her presence. "Protein helps with morning sickness." Mira hovered in the doorway, watching the careful way he moved about the kitchen. There was a practiced efficiency to his actions that spoke of years living alone. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. The spatula stilled in his hand. "I know." They ate in silence at the small kitchen table, the morning sun painting stripes across the checkered tablecloth. Ethan pushed a bottle of prenatal vitamins across to her with his free hand, never looking up from his newspaper. Mira turned the bottle in her hands, reading the label. "You went out this morning? Pharmacy opens at 7. He turned a page with deliberate calm. "You'll need to see an OBGYN soon. I can refer you to someone discreet." Her fingers tightened around the bottle. The thought of doctors, of examinations, sent a ripple of fear through her. "I can't pay for that." Ethan finally looked up, his gaze steady. "We'll figure it out." Something in his tone made her eyes burn. She focused on her eggs, blinking rapidly. The food tasted like ash in her mouth, but she forced herself to swallow. A sudden knock at the front door shattered the fragile peace. Ethan's chair scraped back as he stood. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. Mira heard the murmur of voices, then a familiar laugh that turned her blood to ice. She'd know that careless, booming voice anywhere. Mark, the boy who'd gotten her pregnant, who'd disappeared the moment she told him the news. Her hands began to shake. The fork slipped from her fingers, clattering against the plate. In the hallway, Mark's voice grew louder. "Come on, Doc. I just need to talk to her." Mira stood so quickly her chair toppled over. She needed to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The back door. Maybe she could. Then Ethan's voice cut through the panic, sharp as a scalpel. "You need to leave. Now." The slam of the front door echoed through the house. Heavy footsteps approached the kitchen. Mira stood frozen, bracing for the worst. Ethan reappeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "He's gone." The air rushed from her lungs in a shuddering breath. Ethan righted her fallen chair with quiet efficiency. "You're safe here," he said simply. "That's a promise." For the first time, Mira almost believed it. The days blurred together in a strange, new rhythm. Mira found herself memorizing the patterns of Ethan's house, the way sunlight pooled in the living room at 3 in the afternoon, the particular squeak in the third stair, the comforting smell of antiseptic that clung to his clothes when he returned from the hospital. She began leaving small marks of her presence. A mug washed and placed exactly where he liked it. The newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle she noticed he always attempted. A single wildflower in a juice glass on the kitchen windowsill, picked during her short, cautious walks around the neighborhood. One evening, as she stood at the stove attempting to recreate her mother's chicken soup recipe, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened after a long shift. He inhaled deeply. "Smells like someone's home," he murmured, then froze as if startled by his own words. Mira's hands stilled on the ladle. The simple statement hung between them, heavy with meaning. A sudden sharp pain ripped through her abdomen. The ladle clattered into the pot as she doubled over, gasping. Ethan was at her side in an instant, his physician's mask slipping into place. Contractions? She could only nod, gripping the countertop as another wave hit. Too early. It was too early. The next hours passed in a haze of pain and panic. Ethan's calm voice guided her through each contraction as he drove them to the hospital, his steady presence the only thing keeping her from drowning in fear. When the nurses whisked her away, she reached for him blindly. His hand caught hers, warm and sure. "I'm right here," he promised. Hours later, exhausted and trembling, Mira held her daughter for the first time. The tiny bundle in her arms seemed too fragile, too perfect to be real. Tears streamed down her face as she traced the baby's delicate features. A shadow fell across the hospital bed. Ethan stood there, his usual composure shattered. In his eyes, Mira saw wonder and terror, and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "Have you decided on a name?" he asked, his voice rough. Mira looked down at the sleeping infant. "Lily," she whispered. "After the flowers that grow by your front porch." Ethan's throat worked. He reached out one tentative finger, letting Lily wrap her tiny hand around it. When he spoke, his words were barely audible. "Welcome home, Lily." And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet beeps of hospital monitors and the soft light of dawn filtering through the blinds, Mira understood. This wasn't just a temporary shelter anymore. This was family. The first few weeks with Lily were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, tiny cries, and an overwhelming flood of emotions Mira hadn't anticipated. She had expected exhaustion, but not the way her heart would clench every time Lily's fingers curled around hers. She had braced for fear, but not the paralyzing terror that gripped her at the thought of failing this fragile life. And then there was Ethan. He moved through the house like a quiet storm, always present, always careful, never intruding. He installed a bassinet in the living room, stocked the pantry with easy-to-make meals, and came home from his shifts with bags of baby supplies Mira couldn't afford. But it was the small things that undid her. The way he'd pause by the bassinet before leaving for work, adjusting Lily's blanket with surgeon's precision. The way he started leaving the bathroom light on at night, so Mira wouldn't stumble in the dark during late feedings. She wanted to thank him. The words perched on her tongue 100 times a day, but they always dissolved before she could speak them. "How did you thank someone for giving you back your life?" Then came the night, everything unraveled. Lily had been crying for hours, her tiny face red and scrunched in discomfort. Mira paced the living room, rocking her, singing to her, begging her to just please sleep. But the cries continued, sharp and unrelenting, and with each one, Mira felt the cracks in her composure widen. She didn't realize she was crying until Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep. Without a word, he crossed the room and took Lily from her arms. "Hey," he murmured, cradling the baby against his shoulder. "What's all this fuss about?" Mira wiped furiously at her face. "I don't know. She won't stop. I've tried everything." Ethan pressed a hand to Lily's forehead, then her belly. His brows furrowed. "She's warm. Could be colic." He adjusted his hold, supporting her head with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "Here. Like this." Mira watched as he swayed gently, humming something low and tuneless. Slowly, Lily's cries softened into hiccups, then whimpers, then silence. The weight of her own helplessness crashed over Mira. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Ethan didn't look up. No one does at first. "You do." That made him pause. When he finally met her gaze, his eyes were shadowed. "I had practice." The unspoken words hung between them. The photo on the mantel. The woman and child whose absence echoed in every too-quiet corner of this house. Mira's breath caught. "Your family." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Yes." She didn't ask what happened. The pain in his voice was answer enough. Instead, she reached out, hesitating for only a second before placing her hand over his where it cradled Lily's back. His skin was warm, his fingers tensing slightly at her touch. "You're a good father," she said softly. Ethan went very still. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd crossed a line. Then his shoulders slumped, and he leaned into her touch, just slightly. "And you're a good mother." Something inside Mira's chest cracked open. The next morning, she found Ethan in the kitchen, scribbling notes on a pad of paper. He slid it toward her without comment. Asterisk pediatrician's number. Lactation consultant. 24-hour pharmacy. My schedule this week. Asterisk. Beneath it, in smaller letters. You're not alone in this. Mira traced the words with her fingertip. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she rounded the table and hugged him. Ethan stiffened in surprise, his hands hovering awkwardly at his sides. But as she held on, his arms slowly came up to encircle her, tentative at first, then tight, like he was afraid she'd disappear. Lily gurgled in her bassinet nearby, the sound bright and alive in the quiet kitchen. And just like that, the last of Mira's walls crumbled. 3 months later, asterisk. The paperwork arrived on a Tuesday. Mira stared at the envelope, her hands shaking. "What is this?" Ethan stood stiffly by the couch, his hands in his pockets. "Guardianship papers. For Lily." He swallowed hard. "If you want them." Her vision blurred. "You do that. I do more." His voice was rough. "If you'd let me." Mira looked down at the documents, then at Lily, who was chewing happily on her own fist in Ethan's lap. She thought of the empty house he'd lived in before her. The way he still flinched at loud noises. The way he'd started smiling more lately, like he was remembering how. She took a deep breath. "What if we didn't need these?" Ethan's head snapped up. Mira stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What if we were just a family?" For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Lily cooed between them, her tiny hands reaching for both of them. And just like that, the storm inside Mira finally stilled. The end.